Ever get that feeling? That like buzzy anticipation. You just
Yeah.
know something big is about to happen.
Absolutely.
But the whole world's holding its breath. Well, today we are diving deep into Genesis chapter 17,
Okay.
the story of Abraham and Sarah. And it captures that feeling perfectly.
It's powerful, that feeling of anticipation, expectation. It's something that really seems to resonate across cultures, even faiths, that waiting for a promise to be fulfilled,
Right.
for hope to, well, actually become reality. It's just such a human experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're looking at this through a podcast episode called Genesis 17, The Joy of Promises Fulfilled. And it really delivers on that feeling. Now, Genesis 17 drops us right into this pivotal moment for Abraham and Sarah. But this isn't, a young couple. We're talking about Abraham at 99 years old. Sarah's in her late 80s. They've been promised descendants, as many as the stars, right? But they're still waiting.
Yeah.
Years after God first made that promise.
Yeah, that's a timescale that's hard to even fathom today. Like, imagine carrying that promise with you, that weight, that expectation for decades. What would that do to your faith, to your very soul? That's what's so fascinating about this chapter. We see God reaffirming the covenant with Abraham, and it's not just a repeat. It's like he's hitting the refresh button on their faith, injecting it with this urgency.
Okay, let's unpack this refresh a little, because it starts with God changing their names, right? Abram becomes Abraham, Sarai becomes Sarah.
Yeah.
Almost like a rebranding for this new stage of life.
I love that, the rebranding. It's such a perfect way to put it, because in ancient cultures, names weren't just labels. They held so much weight. Think of it like God's breathing new life into their identities, aligning them with the destiny he has planned. And it's such a powerful symbol of transformation, especially considering their age. Imagine like a complete rebrand at 99.
Talk about a late in life career change, right?
Exactly.
But it wasn't just their names, was it? The promise itself, the scope of it is just mind-blowing. It's not just one son, it's like nations, descendants more than they could even count.
It really is staggering when you think about it. It'd be like being promised a legacy that would just shape the course of history for generations, and not just a personal blessing. No, this is a promise that resonates on a global scale. Imagine the weight of that.
Yeah.
The responsibility, but also the incredible honor of carrying that kind of promise.
And then, just when you think it can't get any bigger, the story takes this turn that really shows us God's character. Because in the middle of this enormous promise, this huge sweeping vision of the future, Abraham stops and advocates for Ishmael. Now, for those who aren't familiar, Ishmael is Abraham's son through Hagar, Sarah's maidservant.
Right, yeah.
And it's such a poignant moment
Really?
because it shows us that even in these grand world-altering promises, God is still so attentive to the individual heart. Abraham is understandably worried about Ishmael's future. Even with the promise of Isaac, he still loves and cares for his firstborn.
Of course, yeah.
And it's not like he just pushes those feelings aside like they don't matter compared to God's plan. He brings his concerns right to God. He says, that Ishmael might live before thee. It's raw, honest. It reveals a vulnerability in Abraham's faith, don't you think? Like he's not afraid to express those anxieties, even to God.
And the most striking thing, it's God's response. He doesn't dismiss Abraham's anxieties, not at all. He directly addresses them. He assures Abraham that Ishmael will be blessed, that he'll have 12 princes, become a great nation. This little compassionate pause in the narrative, it speaks volumes about who God is. He's big enough to plan the course of nations, yet still so intimately involved in the lives of individuals. He cares about all the details, even the ones that seem small in the grand scheme of things.
It's like God's got this amazing tapestry he's weaving, connecting generations, nations, but he still takes the time to make sure even the smallest threads are taken care of.
Exactly. And it's a good reminder for us, too, that we don't have to downplay our anxieties or try to hide them from God. He wants us to come to him with all of our emotions, even the messy ones.
That is so reassuring to hear. Okay, so we've got Abraham and Sarah. Names are changed. The promise is even bigger than before. And God's even addressed Abraham's concerns about Ishmael. What's next? It feels like, we're building towards something even bigger.
You're right, because this is where Genesis 17 really hits us with that, that next year, this time feeling, that anticipation. And remember, we're talking about Abraham at 99 years old. They've been waiting decades for this promise to be fulfilled.
Okay, don't leave me hanging. What happens?
God sets a timeline, a very specific timeline, for Isaac's birth.
Wow.
He tells Abraham, Sarah shall bear thee a son at the set time next year. Just imagine the weight of those words, that feeling of like knowing for sure that the wait is almost over.
Oh, wow. It's getting that boarding pass for a flight you thought you missed. You know, that this is really happening feeling after decades to finally have that assurance, to have that timeline. That must have been overwhelming in the best way possible.
For sure. And think about what that does for their faith, too. The hope, the excitement, the anticipation. Knowing that, this promise, it had a deadline.
Yeah, but here's the thing, and maybe it's just me, but like most of us don't get that kind of specific timeline from God, do we? We wait for a new job, a relationship, maybe we're waiting for a healing, and it can feel like it's taking forever. So how do we hold on to hope that, that next year, this time feeling when it just feels like the waiting never ends?
That's the question, isn't it? And I think it starts by understanding that God's timing, it's not always our timing. Look at Moses, 40 years. 40 years tending sheep in the wilderness before God called him to lead the Israelites out of Egypt.
40 years. That's longer than some people's careers these days.
I know, right? And it shows us something so crucial. God uses those in-between times, those seasons of waiting, those spaces that seem empty, to prepare us for the fulfillment of his promises. He's working behind the scenes, even when we can't see it, shaping us, molding us into the people we need to be to receive those blessings, to carry their weight.
So how do we cultivate that trust, that surrender to God's timing, especially when, we're right in the middle of it? When waiting feels less like anticipation and more like, torture. It really does feel that way sometimes, doesn't it? Like when you're waiting, you're being tested somehow.
Oh, absolutely.
But it's less about passing the test, more like, are we willing to trust that God's timing is, it's part of the plan?
It's like that saying, right? If you want to make God laugh, tell him your plans. Seriously.
Yeah.
But I think it comes down to this, bridging that gap, the gap between how we as humans crave that instant gratification
Right.
and the way God's timing actually works.
Okay. Yeah, I see that.
It's a journey, isn't it? Learning to hold on to hope while also surrendering control.
It is.
And maybe, just maybe, it starts by understanding that a delay from God, it's not a no.
Okay, I like that.
Look at Abraham and Sarah. They had their doubts, times when it felt impossible. Sarah even laughed, when God told her about the child.
At their age? Can you imagine?
Yeah, right. But here's what gets me. Every time. God doesn't punish them for their doubts. Not at all. He meets them right there in that uncertainty, reassures them, and then keeps on unfolding his plan.
I think that's what we need to hear sometimes.
Me too, honestly.
Because it's easy to feel like, God's waiting for us to just get it, to have this perfect, unwavering faith. But this story, it's different, isn't it?
It really is. God is so patient with us, even when we're struggling, when we doubt. And that's the thing about faith, right? It's not about knowing everything, never having questions. It's about holding on to those promises, even when life hasn't quite caught up yet.
So then how do we do that, practically speaking,
Yeah.
How do we build that kind of unshakable faith in the middle of, waiting for who knows how long?
I've thought a lot about this, and one thing that helps me is focusing on what I can control, which is how I respond to the waiting.
Okay, that makes sense.
So instead of getting stuck in frustration and despair, can we see it as an opportunity, a time to grow, to really connect with God?
Build that resilience, right?
Yes, exactly. Like that saying, the same boiling water that softens the potato, it hardens the egg.
Oh, I like that.
It's not the circumstance itself, it's about what you're made of.
So we need to be more like eggs.
Maybe. And, part of becoming that egg, maybe that's about learning to recognize when God is at work, even while we're waiting.
I love that, seeing those little glimmers of hope.
Yes, paying attention to those small victories, those lessons learned.
Yeah.
Because even when it doesn't feel like it, he's using everything for our good and for his glory.
This has been amazing. So much to think about. Before we wrap up, I want to go back to something you said earlier about how if we knew for sure that God would fulfill his promises in our lives, it would change how we're living right now today.
Right.
So here's my question for you and for everyone listening. If you knew, absolutely knew, that God was going to do something amazing in your life a year from now, something you've been praying for, hoping for, how would that change how you live today?
That is such a good question. And you know what? Even without a date on the calendar, God's promises are still true.
That's right.
His timing is still perfect. And the way we respond to that, that's what matters. Our willingness to trust him, even while we wait, that's what changes us from the inside out.
This deep dive has been incredible. God's promises, the meaning of waiting, how to trust his timing. Thank you all so much for joining us as we journey through Genesis 17. And until next time, may you live each day knowing that your next year, this time, it's closer than you think.